Howdy folks, Spencer here, and today I'll be going over the biggest meta changes that we've seen in Star Trek Online over the past 2 years or so that have enabled players to push up to absurdly high DPS numbers over the past couple of months. As always, chapters to each of the topics I'll be talking about today are listed down below. And before I get too far into things, if you're interested in picking up any physical models of the various Star Trek ships, including some of the Star Trek Online Eagle Moss models, head on over to Real Merch via the link in the description or pinned comment down below. And if you find something you want, use code CasualSAB at checkout over there to get 10% off your order. Again, links to that are down below. And starting off at number one is, of course, Isomags. Isomags were introduced just about a year ago, and they completely changed the mentality behind how we build an energy weapon setup. Prior to their release, you wanted as many TAC console slots on a ship as possible so that you could fill them up with the fleet vulnerability locators or exploiters. And with the introduction of the Isomags, it shifted around. Now you wanted as many engineering console slots as you could possibly get. Now, I have a full video that goes over all of the math behind these consoles, so if you want to dive into all the numbers, I'll have that link down below. But to summarize it, Isomags provide a plus max weapon power buff along with a plus weapon power buff, and you can get the same mods on them as you can get with your locators or exploiters, so you can get a plasma one, a phaser one, disruptor, and so on, and you can get the exact same damage buff that you would get from your fleet vulnerability locator or exploiter. The difference is you're trading the crit chance or severity for that stacking weapon power buff. And if you look at my power level here, with 7 of these things on, I am just sitting here in space with 176 weapon power. So these things are insanely impactful for energy weapon performance. And when you look at the numbers, you can see that with 1 to 2 less Isomag slotted, you're able to beat out what plus 1 to 2 locators or exploiters would be able to provide. So for instance, on my legendary Avenger here, I have 7 Isomags. You look at the numbers that I have in that video, that's a damage multiplier of 195.9. And if you look at what 8 locators or exploiters could provide, and it's substantially lower than that. In fact, if I was only running 6 Isomags, it would still beat out the buff that 8 locators or exploiters could provide. So that was a huge shift in how we build ships, and of course that also shifted what ships were the best options for maximizing energy weapon performance. So that's a very, very important change, and those consoles are now much more accessible than they were a year ago. Because the random elite TFO system gives you the parts to make them, the prices have crashed. The only ones that are still somewhat expensive are the phaser modifier ones, but for all of the others, you can pick up a full set of them for typically around 20 to 30 million EC. For the phaser ones, they're a lot more expensive, but they are still quite obtainable in the grand scheme of what your overall build is going to cost. And next up is the Ahwahnee Command Carrier, which came out earlier this year with the 14th anniversary bundle. And this is a ship that I have repeatedly told people that they should go out and pick up. And it's not necessarily for the ship itself. It's a 3-3 carrier. It's not for everyone. It is a good support platform, but it's not the best. The real reason that everyone should have this ship is because of the accessories it has. The hanger pets from it are really, really good. The console from it is something that pretty much every energy weapon build out there should have slotted, and the trait from it also isn't bad for some support-focused builds. But it really is the pets and the console that make this ship so desirable. In fact, when I was going in and picking up a C-Store ship over on my free-to-play account with the 1 T6 coupon that I had from the anniversary giveaway, this is the ship that I went for. The accessories on this are just so hugely impactful that in that situation for that all to count, with me only able to pick up 1 T6 ship for the time being, this is the ship that I went for over everything else out there because I think that the accessories on it are just that important. And I want to take a look at the accessories here bit by bit. We're going to start off with the Starship trait, Flagship Staffing, which is by far the least important of the accessories on this ship. And the way that this works is when you hit a command, hull heal, or shield heal bridge officer ability on a target, and this can include yourself, it is going to reset cooldowns on non-specialization firing modes, but not below their shared cooldowns, and it will provide a 33% firing cycle haste buff for energy weapons for 10 seconds. So 10-second buff, 30-second cooldown, 1/3 uptime. Now, this is more of a support-focused trait. You're probably not going to run this on your DPS build. If you're a new player that decide to pick this ship up as one of your first ships, you could certainly run it, and it would be perfectly fine until you have better traits. But it's not something that everyone needs to slot. Now, if you are running this on a support build, you can apply this trait to multiple allies by using the Command Bridge Officer ability Needs of the Many. This will allow you to apply it to everyone around you. And now we have the console Fleet Power Network Array. As I've talked about many times, if you use an energy weapon build, you should have this console on. And the reason I say that is because this is the best haste console in the entire game. It lasts for 35 seconds. It can be used either on yourself or a targeted ally. And if you're playing in a team environment, you can stack multiple copies of this console onto a single player. So for those really high-end DPS runs, the reason that the weapons are firing so absurdly fast in there is because there's 5 stacks of this console on the DPS player. You've got the console activation from the DPS player themselves, and then 4 from the supporting team. And it just enables that really crazy high fire rate that you see in those high-end run videos. In fact, there's so much haste in that environment from the 5 stacks of the Ahwahnee console that those really high-end DPS runs, those DPS builds don't have any other haste on them. They've taken emergency weapon cycle off, calm before the storm. Every other haste buff that you would traditionally run, those builds take off because of the 5 stacks of this console. Now, if you're just doing channel runs or pug runs or solo stuff, I would still keep emergency weapon cycle and calm on. But in a team environment, if you've got 5 people hitting this console on you, you could probably start looking at messing around with dropping some of those other haste items. Now, the haste buff on this is listed as going from plus 50 to plus 125, and it scales with aux power. It actually can go higher than this. So this will scale with your aux power, and the exact formula is your aux power divided by 80. So at 100 aux power, that means you have that 125% haste buff. And if you somehow had 200 aux power, that would be a 250% haste buff. So if you're on a build that has OSS, if you're on the legendary Gal-X, you can stack OSS plus the OSS console that has, and if you're on an Ninja Captain, you can also do EPS power transfer to get that even higher. The point is, if you have a lot of aux power, and especially if you're above 125, you can get this above the number listed on the tooltip. So it's one of the longest lasting haste consoles in the game, and it provides the largest haste buff out of any console in the game. If you look at the Domino is just a 25% firing cycle haste buff for up to 30 seconds if you're able to get the 10 activations to extend that to its maximum duration. This console is just, you hit it with high aux power, and it's giving you that haste buff for 35 seconds. And it's also giving that to your pets. So if you're on a carrier build and you're looking to boost up your pets, you'd also want to have this console on, and you'd want to hit a battery or OSS to buff up your aux power prior to hitting it. So it's just a really large haste buff that lasts for a very long time. It can be applied to either yourself or to an ally, and it just makes your weapons fire much, much faster. Now, I have 125 aux power here, and just as a demonstration, you can see the time for my disruptor array to fire. This is with me just putting the 1 activation on of this from myself, and when I hit this console, it goes from 1 second to 0.39. So quite crazy there. And the other effect of this, which you just saw happen there, is that every 3 seconds while this console's active, it has a 60% chance to apply a random firing mode to your build. So that can be a beam overload one, a rapid fire one, or a torpedo high yield one. Now, if you have a firing mode active, this will no longer overwrite that. So if you're running CSV, you don't have to worry about this taking that CSV away from you. But it does mean that if you have some downtime with your CSV, you could potentially get a rapid fire. If you have downtime with your beam overload or your fire at will, you might get a beam overload from this. And if you're on a torp setup, you might get a few extra high yields from this console. So it's just all around a really useful console. It provides a huge buff to how fast your weapons fire, and it also buffs up your pets. So it's a console every single player should have, and I'll probably be talking about this much more in future content. And lastly, we have the hangar pets, the Type 7 shuttlecraft. Now, if possible, you want to pick up the elite version of these. If you're not sure how to get the elite hangar pets, I have a video, which is linked down below, that explains the process. But with the elite version of these pets, they have attack pattern beta 3, close-in sensor pass 3, and they have a beam fire at will 1 with 2 Omni beams. So these are hangar pets that can be used on any ship that have fire at will with 2 Omni beams. They have attack pattern beta 3, which is a 50 debuff per pet. And then they have close-in sensor pass 3, which is a single target up to 80 debuff per pet. And you can have 6 of these out per hangar bay. So when you do the math on those, it gets quite crazy. Because if you're just looking at the attack pattern beta, that's up to 300 debuff from one bay of these. But then they also have that close-in sensor pass, which is up to an 80 debuff. So if you add that together with the beta and times that by 6 pets in the hangar bay, that's a potential for these things to be thrown out, up to 780 debuff per hangar bay to various enemies on the map. Now, there is a cap on how far you can debuff a foe, but if you have a ton of these pets all hitting the same target, you are going to be hitting that debuff cap on some of the foes that you're attacking. And debuffing enemies makes them much easier to take out. By now, I would imagine most of you are familiar with how resistance helps you stay alive better in content. Well, when you're in most PvE content, you want to go in with debuffs on your build, things like attack pattern beta, which is going to lower the resistance of the foes that you're fighting. And the resistances can go into the negative. I went in and did a quick demonstration here in a quick PvP just to show that you can get really far into the negatives on a target. And the cap, I think, is around 295. Someone correct me down below. But you can get up to negative 295 in each of the resistance categories on a target. And that is basically going in and taking whatever damage you're doing to the target and quadrupling it. So if you're wanting to know how those really high numbers happen, that's another key way. Stacking as many stacks of attack pattern beta as you can on a target to lower their resistances far into the negatives so that you're getting much more damage out of everything you're doing. So you can see here on just this random sphere, I had 18 stacks of attack pattern beta plus another stack of a lower rank of beta. It gets crazy. So stacking debuffs has always been crucial to getting really high DPS numbers. And these are hangar pets that can be used on any ship that are going around with fire at will, plus attack pattern beta, plus another debuff with close-in sensor pass. They don't do much damage, but the point is they're debuffing things a ton so that you and your team can get a lot more damage out of everything else on your build. So if you're wanting to go in and buff up your weapons, these types of pets are going to be desirable to maximize your weapon output. And again, these can be used on any ship. There have been other pets in the game before that had attack pattern beta with fire at will, but they were limited to specific ships, like the Styx pets or the Recluse ones. And these are ones that you can go and take out and put on any ship that has a hangar bay slot. So hugely impactful. And again, stacking attack pattern beta, especially with these pets, is one of the key components to how those high numbers are achieved. And while we're on the topic of 14th anniversary bundle stuff, the Atlantis Temporal Destroyer does also have a pretty nice haste trait on it, Temporal Tunneling. And what's nice about Temporal Tunneling is that it's 100% firing cycle haste for 5 seconds with a 15-second cooldown, so 1/3 uptime, averaging out to 33% firing cycle haste. And there are a ton of abilities that can be used to keep Temporal Tunneling up. The Stow Wiki has a full list of them, which you can see over at the right. And you're not likely going to run this if you're doing high-end runs with 5 stacks of the fleet power console off the Ahwahnee, but if you're looking for another haste trait to run for solo or just random content, this is a good one to look at. And as you can see, there are plenty of options out there for abilities to keep it up every 15 seconds. And coming in at number 4 is the Omnidirectional Pahvan Proton Beam, which is currently the top performing set Omni Beam you can get if you're on an AoE based build, so Cannon Scatter Volley or Fire at Will. If you're on a single target build, this Omni Beam will perform substantially lower than it would on an AoE build. That's just the nature of how most AoE versus single target stuff is in Stow. Single target just always has that lower performance potential. But with this Omni Beam, what makes it so special for AoE builds is that it is able to utilize either beam or cannon firing modes, meaning that if you're on a cannon scatter volley build, this Omni Beam is going to get the equivalent rank of Fire at Will as your cannon scatter volley, and it's going to be up for the entire duration that you have your cannon scatter volley up. So if you're on a CSV build with Withering Barrage and you're doing CSV 3, this is going to have Fire at Will 3 up for 14 out of 15 seconds on this Pahvan Proton Beam. So really good uptime on it on an AoE build, and the damage from it is honestly pretty good. In a lot of the runs that we've been trying it in, and especially these high-end ones, we've been seeing that the beam array is not that far off most of the turrets we would run, but what really makes it stand out is the resonance shock proc that it has. Now, this proc has a 33% chance to activate, which is why it is going off so much in these runs, and it does excel against groups of enemies that you have up against you. So ideally have some control in the run, but it is able to do quite a bit there. And if I pull that parse of Michi's back up, you can see that the resonance shock there, the proc from this Omni Beam, did more than his Maelstrom torpedo with a torpedo spread 3. So it's doing a lot of damage on an AoE heavy build. Again, for single target stuff like Beam Overload or Surgical Strikes, it's not going to get anywhere near that level of performance. That's just the nature of single target versus AoE. But for CSV or FA, this thing is just crazy. And if you want, you can also put the Pahvan Crystal Battery Console on to try and get a little bit more damage out of it. I've found you don't really need the console, but if you are looking for something to slot, then that console does certainly work. And if you want to pick that Proton Beam up, it is available from the Defensive Pavo event that happened earlier this year, which was the first part of the event campaign for 2024, meaning that it's going to be a $25 buyout if you missed it. And alongside buying it out to get that beam and the torpedo and console in that set, you are also going to get 700 campaign progress. So if you're a bit far behind on the campaign, if you're returning right now, or you're a new player looking to get caught up, then buying this event out to get that Omni Beam and get that campaign progress might be something worth considering. Next up at number 5 is the Maelstrom torpedo launchers. So there's 2 versions of these in the game so far, and they do have an equip limit of 2. So the first one is from the legendary Akira. This is the Maelstrom Quantum Torpedo Launcher. And the other one is the Trifluoride Maelstrom, which was from an event that happened late in 2023 and is currently not available if you missed that event. So these torpedoes are not the easiest to obtain right now. The Maelstrom Quantum there is from a legendary bundle, the legendary First Strike one. So pretty expensive, but the reason that you would care about these torpedoes is because they are a very long cooldown torpedo. They can store up to 3 charges, and they will absolutely devastate whatever you are hitting with them, whether it be with the high yield or a torp spread. I personally prefer to use these things with a torp spread. And what I find, especially if you let them build up to the full 3 charges, is you're going to get a couple million damage from that hit. So they do devastating amounts of damage, and if you look at the impact for them on a torpedo build, they're crazy. For instance, on Nick's current torpedo record, which is the highest up on the SCM table right now, the Maelstrom quantum torpedoes he had 2 of them on his Eagle, and they accounted for almost half of his damage. So if you're looking for a really good torpedo to put on that does have a longer cooldown and can just do a huge amount of damage when it is available to fire, then the Maelstroms may be something you want to look at. If you're looking for a torpedo that can fire faster to use with things like ETM for fire at will, these aren't the torps for you. They have a 25-second recharge. But if you're fine with having that longer recharge in exchange for getting a high burst of damage, these Maelstroms just do such a good job. And on the topic of torpedoes, in early 2023, the Terran Eagle pilot raider was put into the game. And with that, there's a console on it in which, if you use that console on a ship that has a commander pilot, it will set your torpedo shared recharge time down to half a second, whereas every other non-pilot ship would have 1.5 seconds. And what that means is that if you're looking to go after a really high-performing torp build, the Terran Eagle is basically the only good option you have right now, because it is the only platform you have out there that has a good weapons layout for torps, a commander pilot for the half-second recharge that console can provide, and it also has the ability to run Concentrate Firepower 3 on a Lieutenant Commander command seat. So if you're a torpedo player and you're looking to really push your performance up, the Terran Eagle just blows every other ship out of the water for torps. It's really unfortunate that for torpedoes, we're now at a point where for the really high-end meta for torps, the Eagle is literally the only viable platform for doing competitive stuff with torpedoes. You can still do other ships perfectly fine with torps. The classical torp builds still work, but if you're looking to push the maximum you can, the Eagle is the only one that gets the ability to fire torps 3 times faster than the other ships while retaining access to Concentrate Firepower 3. And coming in at number 7 is Plasma. Plasma is actually good now thanks to the accessories that we got with the Gorn Hunter Pilot Raider, a lockbox ship that released early in 2023. That ship has a trait, console, experimental weapon, and quad cannon on it that all provide very nice boost for Plasma-based builds. And what that's resulted in is Plasma becoming the top performing energy weapon flavor to use in elite content when chasing maximum performance, because the stacking dot that you get from the complex plasma fire trait just does so much damage on a full plasma build. So if you're looking at any of the recent high-end DPS records for elite content, you're going to see that the majority of them are actually all plasma. Now, if you're doing normal or advanced content, I would say Phaser or Disruptor are still going to be better there because of how fast that stuff is. But if you are looking to push for maximum energy weapon performance in Elite, you may really want to take a serious look at Plasma if you can get your hands on that Gorn Hunter Pilot Raider. Now, other flavors like Disruptor and Phaser are still perfectly viable in Elite content. It's just that dot really does a lot for Plasma. And if you want to learn more about those types of builds, I do have a video going over most of the fundamentals, which I'll have linked down below. It's also going over a build that I was using for quite a long time over on the Delkina. This video is from October of 2023 though, so it is missing some newer items like the Type 7 pets off the Ahwahnee, and of course the Fleet Power Network Array console. So I would just make sure to adjust the build to include those new items, but the rest of the build here still holds up very well, and those accessories off that Gorn Hunter, again, are very, very effective. Now, a quick note, if you are doing one of these plasma builds with CSV, I would highly recommend you pick up the Plasmatic Biomatter Auto Turret from the Lobby store during a Lobby sale. We have found that the auto turret effect on this really helps stack up those complex plasma fire stacks. And at number 8 is that alongside the release of the legendary Bordeaux last year, Cryptic made it so that the flagship console set that comes off the T6 Scimitars, Odysseys, and Bordeaux is now unlocked and able to be used on whatever ship you want. So the big console to worry about there is Adaptive Emergency Systems. That is a really nice alternative to DPRM if you don't have it. And if you happen to have both, they do work well alongside each other. So that's some nice survivability and damage buffs that you can get from that console. You can also do the 2 and 3 piece on whatever ship you want. If you're going for some of the other consoles, I would take a look at the Flagship TAC computer, which is going to provide a firing cycle haste buff and a turn rate and speed buff to you and your allies for 15 seconds. Does also have a Cat 1 19% directed energy damage buff on it. And if you're looking for a third console to go for this set, if you wanted to run that 3-piece for whatever reason, I would go with the Timeline Stabilizer that you can get from the Krenum Science ship in the Epic Phoenix store. The Dampening Wave Emitter is not a very good console, so if you are doing the 3-piece, I would try to get that Timeline Stabilizer, but for me personally, I just end up using Adaptive Emergency Systems on its own most of the time, and that is a console you can get for a very, very cheap price off a variety of C-store ships. And next up at number 9, Cryptic has now made it so that all factions are able to get a full set of superior Romulan operative bridge officers from the Fleet Embassy. So they are unfortunately a bit more expensive than the original rare TAC ones had been, but they removed the rare TAC ones and then they put them all in as very rare, meaning that each SRO that you want from the Fleet Embassy is going to set you back 160k fleet credits and 40,000 dilithium at its base cost, but that can be discounted down to 34,000 dilithium per if you have a completed dill mine. So you can get a full set of SROs on a Fed or Klingon character now, but it is going to cost you quite a bit. In addition, for the Romulan faction itself, they did fix the long-standing issue in which the Romulan faction SROs were giving a larger crit chance and severity buff than they were meant to. So now all factions are getting the exact same buff from their SROs. And in addition, they have introduced an alternative to SROs called Watchers. Watchers can be acquired via the exchange or via lockboxes. And the difference is SROs have a 2% crit chance buff and 5% severity, whereas Watchers each provide 3% crit chance and 3% severity. So if you are at a lower crit chance, then you may want to just go with the Watchers anyways over the SROs, especially when you factor in that those Watchers are going to cost you probably around 25 to 30 million EC per on the exchange, whereas the SROs right now, 160k fleet creds and 34k lithium per, that can easily add up to be more than that 25 to 30 million EC. And at number 10 is that Cryptic recently buffed TAC Team, Side Team, and Inch Team to lower their activation time from 1 second down to half a second, bringing them in line with most other abilities. This is a good change for the meta because for a long time, a lot of high-end builds were starting to not incorporate team abilities because that long activation time could actually interfere with weapons firing. So now that these have a lower activation time, you can start to integrate them back onto builds. Unfortunately, though, Intel Team does still have a 1 second activation time, but all of the other team abilities are fine. Next up at number 11 is the Bozeman Intel Heavy Frigate. So this is a perfectly fine C-store ship on its own. There is also a fleet version of it. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because the accessories on it have proven to be quite useful over time. The console is Tachyon Netrons, has some okay passives there with the crit chance and severity buff. But what's really nice about this console is the clicky it has. If you use this alongside like a Gravwell, you are going to debuff a group of enemies, and you are also going to knock their shields offline quite a bit. So if you're looking for a console that you can use against a group of enemies that's going to really debuff them and knock their shields offline, this is a really good console for that. And this console is also one of the key components to how we are able to keep the shields offline on some of the foes in these really high-end runs, because this quite often will reliably shut their shields off and, of course, apply that debuff. And you've probably seen this in action before. It's a blue net that goes around your foes, which I will show you here quick. So let me reslot this on the build, and let's head into a patrol.
Containment breach! Evacuating all personnel!
Hull is buckling.
And there's the visual of it. So you, like I said, you've probably seen this in action quite a bit in some TFOs. It is rather effective. And the other nice thing about the Bozeman is the trait it has, the active temporal surge. So this is a starship trait that is a clicky. Now, there is a big quirk to this trait in that you need to have it unslotted prior to entering a map and then reslot it once you're in. If you leave it slotted, it will be on a 2-minute cooldown upon you entering the map. So if you want it to have no cooldown, make sure to deslot it. But the reason you go through all that hassle is because this is a really nice buff for 10 seconds, and it can be up every 40 if you have enough stuff on your build to cool it down. But during that 10 seconds, it's 100% crit chance, 600% turn rate, and 750% flight speed strength. So I'm going to show you now how it works. So let's head on into a patrol here. And again, upon entering the map, you need to make sure that you have the trait deslotted, because if I had the trait slotted as I went into the map, it would be on a 2-minute cooldown. So you can see here that it is now available for me to click, and again, that is providing just a huge speed buff, and again, a really nice crit buff while it's active. So 100% crit chance for that 10 seconds, along with really high maneuverability. And, you know, going back again to that DPS run, this is how I was getting from, you know, the various points of the map to the next point so fast. So during the start group, I hit this temporal surge ability to get over to the right side really fast. And then it was that run was still fast enough that it was still up to help me get back to the center faster. So really nice speed boost. And when you use it at the right time, it just does a lot for you. Okay, and heading into number 12 here, we're going to talk about the friendship, but for the remaining items I'm talking about, these are more tailored towards those really engaged with high-end or coordinated play. Everything else that I've mentioned so far, I think can be relevant to pretty much all performance levels, but what I'm talking about for the rest of the video, again, it's really tailored for that high-end play. So the friendship is something that's gotten a lot of discussion in recent times, and I want to explain why it is so important for these high-end runs. And the biggest thing here is actually the starship trait. So let me zoom in on that for you. So the trait is cooperation is the dominant strategy. And the way that this is used in high-end runs is that each of the 4 supporting players will have this trait on, and each of them can apply 5 stacks of this trait to the DPS player. Each person is responsible for keeping their 5 stacks refreshed, meaning that you need to use a heal on the DPS player at least once every 30 seconds so that your stacks don't fall off. But for each stack, that's plus 10% damage, and again, that's 5 times per player. And if you X4 that, you know, for 4 players running it, that's a 200% at 2 damage buff for everything on the DPS player's build if all of the 4 players on the supporting team have this trait equipped and are using abilities to apply stacks of it to that person. Now, the way that we generally have been doing this is with our support builds, we're all doing the Silik for a reason I'll talk about here with the next point. But what we'll do is we'll have a loadout for prep phase. And with that prep phase loadout, we have a bunch of heals on the build. So I'm on that right now. And what I would do is I'd go in to the infected hive or whatever. I'm on this prep phase loadout, and I've got the trait equipped. I'm going to target the DPS player, and I'm going to apply the stacks of the trait to them immediately. And I actually have some footage of that in action, so you can see I'm in that prep phase loadout. I target Cheops here, who's on DPS. I hit him with some heals right away. And as soon as I hit my heals on him, I swap to a different loadout. And I just keep making sure that I'm hitting heals on him within the time frame needed to refresh the stacks I've applied. So you can see 20-ish seconds left on the timer. We almost have all 20 stacks on him. And as we go in, the DPS player should have the full 20 stacks from the supporting team on them. That's one of the key routes as to how we're getting the numbers that we're getting, is because we just have that coordination, the large damage buffs going out. So Cheops has the 20 stacks of the friendship trait there for 200 Cat 2, and we're also all hitting fleet power on him. We've hit a team battery, a team Oxbat tier, which you can get from the Dill store, to just make sure everyone's Ox power is maxed out to get as much as we can from the Ahwahnee console. And you can see fleet power has been hit on him. And once fleet power is activated, target off of them. And then you go in and do your thing. So if you're in a left-right run, slower run, you'd want to click on the DPS player, and within 30 seconds, make sure to toss another heal on them. You are responsible for the 5 stacks you apply to them. So if there's multiple people that have applied stacks, then each of them will need to make sure to apply a heal or a console to the DPS player, within that 30 seconds to keep their stacks up. So the trait from the friendship is really substantial with its effect there. It's very expensive to get. That's one of the biggest limitations for these high-end runs right now, I'd say, for people, is to get really involved with these really bleeding edge high-end runs. You want everyone to have this trait, and it's really difficult when it's a lockbox ship that isn't in a MUDs bundle. So very expensive to obtain, but it is really needed to get that really nice damage buff to get the largest buff possible for the DPS player. And the console off of the friendship is also quite nice. You can apply this buff here to your allied DPS player, and it's going to give them that 7.5% crit chance buff, which is, of course, going to be helpful for the 20 seconds it's up. And this is where that lightning effect comes into play also, that you've seen in some of the DPS run videos, because this will do that, or will cause that electrical damage there. Now, the DPS player doesn't actually get the damage registered to them. Rather, the damage this does is going to be registered to the support player that hits it on the DPS player. And the damage it does is really not that much. I think we were looking, and it was like 60k on one of the runs. It's such a small number that it's insignificant, basically irrelevant. So you don't have to worry about that stealing too much damage from the DPS player. You can go ahead and use this to give them the crit chance buff. And you can also use this as a trigger for one of the stacks of the friendship trait. So it's just a good trait, or a good console to have on for a support build to give that crit chance buff. And of course, like I said, the trait itself off the friendship is just essential for those runs. Now, the friendship itself is also a really viable support tank platform. We don't use it in these really high-end runs because we have an issue with the in which we pretty much have to use the Silik because of the IFF console, which is the next topic. But for normal gameplay, just doing randoms, channel stuff, whatever, The Friendship is a very viable tank platform. You can set it up to support as well. But we're not using it like that right now because of the next topic. So let's head on over and talk about that. Okay, so number 13 is the Silik here. And the issue that we have is that the Silik and the Blackguard, the other variants of this ship for each of the other factions, these are the only ships that can use the console that the Silik has, the IFF manipulator. And this IFF manipulator is essential for the runs at the really high levels. And the reason for that is because this console can provide a massive up to 400 debuff to a single target. Now, this does diminish per other foe nearby that target, but if you're using it strategically in a run, this is a console that makes it substantially easier to go in and take out a boss at a crucial point of the run or a big target. So pretty much the entire supporting team, both supports and both side nukes in these high-end split runs, and all four supports and tank in the slower left-right stuff, pretty much all have to be in the Silik because of this console. I have asked a few times to get this thing unbound, but because it is locked to this ship, pretty much if you are doing support at a very high level, you pretty much have to be in the Silik or one of these other variants. Now, the Silik ends up being the preferred of the options here because it does have a battle cloak, and it just, with that battle cloak, it just has the most potential if you're also using it to do side nuking, which is what mine is set up for here, to go in and nuke the side. It's not optimal. We've been able to make it work, but because of this console's limitations, we are completely locked out from really exploring some of the other platforms for supporting that they've tried to introduce, like the Ahwahnee, the Friendship. I'd love to try and use those in these runs, but because of this limitation here, I can't do it. Okay, at number 14 now is the return of the Kinetic Cutting Beam. So with these really high-end runs, with all the coordination, all the stuff going on there, I would love to have stayed in the Delkina, but we found, because the experimental weapons don't benefit from the haste buffs we have, that they were falling behind hard. And moving over to 5-3 setups with like the VOD War Juggernaut and the Legendary Avenger here has enabled some experimentation. And Sizer had pointed out that the KCB is benefiting from all this haste stuff. So we decided to try it out in some runs with the 2-piece with the assimilated module. And that 2-piece has a proc on it that just basically removes weapon power cost on your build. And as soon as we tried it, it was like, damn, this is even more effective than any of us had expected. Basically, with this 2-piece on, with us having, all these stacks of the Ahwahnee console like I talked about before, it's basically removing weapon power cost. So if you pay attention to the weapon power, throughout some of the videos of these high-end runs, the power is barely dropping. And that is because of the Kinetic Cutting Beam with the proc. It's staying up so often because of how much haste we have that for some of these runs, it's damn near up the entire time. It's just really, really insane. So there's that perk to it, but then there's also the fact that in these coordinated runs, because all of the targets that we're shooting basically have no shields, this thing does a lot of damage. In some of the runs, let me pull up the parse here. In some of these runs, it's basically been doing as much damage as another 4 weapon. So basically, if you look at my dual heavy ultimates here, I had 5 of those on. So let's get the calculator out here. That's 2, 3, 3, 5, 506. Divide that by 5. That averages out to 467k DPS per the HC I had on. The KCB was right behind that at 462k. So in these runs, having the Kinetic Cutting Beam on, it's like having a 6th forward weapon with the damage output it has, because there's no shields at all in these supported coordinated runs. And then that 2-piece It's just removing weapon power cost. So the KCB, I know we sort of we've memed on it a bit over the years as not being really relevant anymore, but Sizer thankfully had the thought to give it another try, and damn, it has panned out very, very well. So if you are going in doing these really coordinated runs, I love the Delkina, but moving out of the Delkina over to the Vodmore Jug or the Inquiry or Legendary Avenger to do the Pahvan Omni aft, the Plasmatic Biomatter Auto Turret plus the KCB, I think you're going to have a much more successful time pushing for records with that combo versus the Delkina. And the last thing here is the Tholian Nucleating Core. Now, this is from an event that happened last year, so if you missed out on it, you're sort of screwed. But basically, when you get kills, this will generate Tholian warp crystals. And what we have found is when you are able to get a bunch of enemies grouped up and to have them all die at the same time up against a bigger like boss target like the tac cube and infected, it just does a ton. And if you again look back at that VOD of that Avenger run, if you saw how low the cube was as it spawned in, it's because all the spheres just died right on it. They created warp crystals. The Borg cube had its shields down because it was in a couple of the Tachyon net drones, and it spawns in basically at like 60% health. So those Tholian warp crystals helped a lot there, and of course the warp core breaches from the spheres. So we have seen some runs where people have had spikes of almost 1,000,000 DPS from the Tholian Nucleating Warp Core. Game Freaks found that it does overproc in some situations, but I mean, if you have it, I would use it for DPS chasing. I think that there's a few different things that are a little wonky right now in the current state of the game, but with the transition going on, I think it could end up being, a couple years till DECA actually looks at some of the things that have been released in a somewhat broken state in the past year or so. So yeah, it's a little bit wonky. Even when it's working right, though, it still does perform quite well. So even though it can overperform in some situations for DPS chasing, I would still run it right now. Everyone else is if you have it. So yeah, that's pretty much it here now. So that is the 15 major things I wanted to talk about. I didn't know how long it would take me to get this done, but apparently about 3 hours. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them down below. Hopefully I've answered everything here thoroughly enough. There's certainly some things that I've probably missed from the past, year and a half, 2 years, but these were the main ones that I could think of when brainstorming this video. So that's going to be it for today. As always, thank you to all channel members and viewers for the continued support. See you guys around.